Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video I'll be taking you through my June reading wrap up. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? The first book that I'll mention in my June reading, the first book that I took on in June for my reading was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Now, this edition, I believe, is the HarperCollins edition. I don't know if you can see that. And evidently, they thought it was a good idea to ride the Twilight fashion when designing this cover. I mean, look at it. It doesn't say anything about Wuthering Heights, really. But what I can say, it comes out with a really, really nice font. You know, very easy to read, plenty of room for jotting, and a decent flop. Not the best flop like Oxford Classics, but a flop nonetheless. The book itself is sublime. Now, I know I read this years and years and years ago when I was younger, but I couldn't remember anything about it. And so going back to it, I was quite struck by the weight of mood in this book. This book is so very Gothic. You may have seen my other video, 8 Aspects of Gothic Literature. Well, this ticks all of them. The book itself is extraordinarily forceful. It's very gritty, earthy, aggressive, full throttle from beginning to end. The use of emotions in the characters, particularly Cathy and Heathcliff with their great love affair, it's volcanic, and you will see them too occasionally erupt, but there's always this lingering sense that an eruption is about to take place in the lives of everybody around them. The story itself, if you don't know, roughly, is there is a family, the Earnshaws, and one day the father comes home from a business trip and he's brought with him this little urchin called Heathcliff, who's got no manners and is introduced to the family. But one of the family, the daughter, Cathy, she really takes to him. She is a very passionate and emboldened young lady. She loves going out into the wilds of the moors of Yorkshire. She loves to have a rough and tumble, your proper sort of tomboy kind of character. But the other two don't really like him, and he's snubbed. But the father seems to have more interest in this Heathcliff than his own children. So when the father eventually passes away, well, the older son who inherits has his chance to spurn Heathcliff and cause trouble. Typical of Gothic literature, you have this double setup, these two houses. The Wuthering Heights of the novel and Thrushcross Grange, I believe it's called. Do I remember that correctly? I think it's Thrushcross Grange. And with these two houses and two households, two families, you get this sort of chiaroscuro, light and dark, of the passion and vitriol and violence and anger and brooding of Wuthering Heights. Wuthering being a phrase in the area, means withering. So it's got a very Gothic connotation, being windstruck and hammered by the elements. It's a heavy, dark set edifice in which Heathcliff, who is a dark set, brooding, sullen, violent man, resides. And Thrushcross Grange, where life actually, there is good family life, but they look a bit like milksops compared to Heathcliff. There is this all-consuming, passionate binary cycle as Cathy and Heathcliff orbit one another, and their lives are so intertwined, but it's self-destructive. It's sort of an all-consuming passion. And you won't expect the way that their love affair turns out, to be quite honest. But through the book, this unlimited force of emotion, this greediness, this self-obsession in a self-love, and the desire for revenge, which is deep in this, the abuse, both verbally, psychologically, domestically, was so raw and gritty that it shocked quite a lot of people in its day. Charlotte Bronte said of Emily Bronte that she had a power that she was not aware of. And she gets down to the absolute primal sensations that we all have. But there is a lesson in forgiveness here compared to revenge. I won't go into how, but if you've read it, you might know. But it's surprisingly subtle for such a vivid book, for such a in-your-face story, and a relentless attack on your senses of what is right and wrong and moral. It will disgust you in ways, but it's one of those like car crash books where you have to watch what's going on, despite the horrendous treatment of some of its characters. Right at the beginning, the narrator calls Wuthering Heights a misanthropist's heaven, because there seems to be no luxuries there and no kindness there, and everything is oppressive and hard and austere compared to the Thrushcross Grange, where the narrator stays a while and learns the backstory of the two families at the heart of this book. There's a suggestion of the supernatural. Or is it supernatural? Or is it our psyche that the emotions sort of fill, and then maybe a story or people so powerful that cross our lives that we can't seem to accept that they don't haunt everywhere long afterwards? This book was incredible. It won't be everyone's cup of tea, but I do recommend it as a tour de force of the Gothic genre unbound. Sort of really let go. And I'm not surprised that it caused quite a ruckus when it came out. It's still a hard read emotionally today. So that was my first book of the month, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. My second book that I read in the month of June was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. What a book! Have you read this book? Comment down below if you have. If you haven't, you really should go and read this book. It is a masterpiece. The style of writing that Harper Lee has is just so easy. It's so lovely to read. It's like floating along on a languid river being pulled by a soft current in the sultry glow of a sun-honeyed sky. It's just brilliant. Harper Lee's skill. What a gifted narrator this woman is. She's just unbelievably flexible and able to adapt to all the situations that are going on in the book. The book itself is concerned with a court case going on where a black man has been accused of raping a white woman who is sort of referred to as trailer trash. Racism is prominent in the town, the jury is all white, it looks like a foregone conclusion that Tom, the one who's accused, is going to be found guilty. But his case is given to a brilliant and fair-minded lawyer called Atticus Finch, whose name has become quite legendary in common folklore. Most people have heard of Atticus Finch. The genius of this book, though, is it's written from the perspective not of the lawyer, but of the lawyer's little daughter, Scout. Her name, I believe, is Jean-Louise or Jean-Louise, but she's nicknamed Scout. And Scout is just a little girl. She's got an older brother called Jem, short for Jeremy, and they bump into this lad who appears every summer holidays called Dill, who comes from a very broken family that doesn't really love him. The three of them live next door to this recluse character called Boo Radley, and he lives with his father, who they occasionally see the father go into town and bring some things back, but they never ever see the son. And there's all these wild stories about him, and you see the children feeding their imagination regarding what Boo Radley looks like, what he's done, does he like consume children at night, those kind of things. And there's a lot of little events happen through the book. There's a tree by Boo Radley's house where gifts and messages begin to be found. They play games pretending to be Boo Radley. There's that scene in the night when they venture into the back garden of the dreadful mansion next door. Very gothic. But then they become to be aware of this case that's going on because, of course, their father is frowned upon for defending a black man on the accusation of raping a white woman. The town automatically conclude because he is black, he must be guilty. But it's the way the father teaches Scout and Jem fairness, human compassion, not being ignorant. And this is where the brilliance of having a child as the main narrator comes in. Children are not born racist or prejudiced in any way. They learn these prejudices from older ones. But through Scout's eyes, because she has that innate sense of justice that all children have, and she has a father who can explain things better, you can see how she sees the follies and the crooked thinking and nasty ways of modern people. It's brilliant. And how she gets compassion. Calpurnia, the servant, the black servant in the house. You know, they have things to do with her. She treats the children very well, but strict and disciplines them in what is right and wrong. The children will visit her church and get to see how other black people live and how they are, and how they're quite nice compared to the aggressive nature of a lot of the white people in town. There's a whole cast of mini characters as well, and it doesn't strike you straight away, but by the end of the book you'll sit back and think, oh, all these characters, they have to all come to terms with disappointment in some way. And it's really clever because it knits everyone in the community, regardless of race or social position, together, and yet it's stretched over with this gauze of prejudice and wrong thinking. The title itself is very critical, To Kill a Mockingbird. There is a point in the book where Jem and Scout are given air rifles and they're told you can shoot as many blue jays as you want, but don't forget it is a sin to kill a mockingbird. And this is later explained to Scout what it means. One of her neighbours, Miss Maisie I think it is, says a mockingbird is a bird that does no damage to anyone else. It is totally innocent. It just brings pleasure to people's lives. So you should never kill it. And of course, the mockingbird stands for different characters who are prejudiced against in the community, who do no wrong, but society sinfully shoots them, as it were. So, what an excellent book. Definitely a book I will be reviewing later on. So, that was number 2. The third book that I read was Agnes Grey by Emily Bronte. So this is one of the Oxford World Classics and it hangs quite easily in the hand. It doesn't perfectly flop because I haven't quite broke the spine, but it's lovely. It's got a good font, plenty of margins for note-taking, excellent quality print. What's remarkable about the Bronte sisters is they all write so individualistically. Emily in Wuthering Heights, I mean, talk about thump. Anne is more reserved of emotion, but more viciously critical of the societal setup. In the book, you have Agnes Grey. She lives at home with her parents and sister. Now, her dad's a rector or a pastor, and he's married a woman who comes from a high status, but because she married beneath her, the family have cut her off. But their family is happy. And love is the thing that reigns supreme over the home. And she gets on well with her sister too. But due to some economic misfortune, Anne wants to help the family. And she says, I want to be a governess. The family sort of say, well, that's not necessary. But Anne really wants to contribute. Being the youngest daughter, she wants to add something. She feels she does nothing for the family. And so she says, let me go and become a governess. And what this book does, she goes to 2 different families and she tries to be a governess there. And Agnes Grey writes the book from the first person, explaining to the reader the things that she sees as a governess and how youngsters are brought up in these higher, well-to-do families. You cannot help but think that since Anne Bronte literally was a governess, as indeed were both her sisters, that this is autobiographical. This is literally what she saw in the families that she taught. And the seed that she plants here will grow into a more fully fleshed form in The Tenant of Wildfowl Hall, which is an outstanding hypothesis-based book, which, wow, it's just great. Agnes Grey is not as good as The Tenant of Wildfowl Hall, but I would definitely say read it first because it will plant Anne Bronte's original idea in your mind that will come to fruition. You will see it in The Tenant of Wildfowl Hall. What Anne Bronte is saying is a lot of the vanity and the misbehaviour of people of the upper classes, their roguish ways, their condescension towards the poor, their lack of fellow feeling, their impropriety and immorality, all stems from their childhood. Anne Bronte points out how this happens. When she goes to 2 different families, her problem is you are to be a governess, you are to teach them how to be proper and how to conduct themselves and to be examples to everybody, but you're not allowed to discipline them. Only the parents can discipline them. And when Anne points out their faults, the parents don't want to know. No, my child is perfect, my child is wonderful. And when they are asked to discipline their children, the discipline is so slight that the children don't care if they don't listen to their governess. They don't care if they beat her up, if they are mean to her. There's several instances where she tries to just have them trapped on the naughty step, as it were. But the kids know that they can spit and pull her hair, and if there's other siblings, they can help their sibling who's in trouble or being disciplined get out of the seclusion of being in the corner of the room. And there's nothing that a governess can do. And yet when the kids do bad things, the parents blame the governess, not the children. And Agnes Grey shows this for boys and then moves on more to girls in the next family, and how they're coquettes, flirts, and how they want to indulge in luxuries and vain pursuits, and that they are morally worthless, and that they're going to end up in lives which are oppressive. And I won't tell you exactly what happens to all of the children that she sort of attends to, but she contrasts it with a small, quiet love interest with a very moral, upright preacher who works under a very corrupt priest who only wants to mix with the high society, and how Agnes and this younger preacher have an attention for the poor. And she talks about how the poor think, how they feel, the desire for a closeness to God, which the church won't give them because the church desires to be closer to the rich. It's a very, very interesting book. I wouldn't say it's a 5 out of 5 book. In some respects, it's a 3 out of 5. I think that's being hard. But if you're going to read Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, you need to read this first. It will add a certain colour and flavour, sort of an amuse-bouche, before you go into the main meal, which is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which is also about the education of the younger members of the higher classes and why they turn out to be such rotters. So a very, very interesting book in a style different to both of her sisters. So that was number 3, Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. The 4th book that I read this month was Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This is the old popular Penguin Classic edition, which I picked up at some charity shop somewhere. And it's got a nice cover. As you know, I like to jot things all over books, which is why I read in paperback. But whenever I get a book that I think is an absolute world beater, then I will go out and buy the hardback. And so I bought Mansfield Park in the Chiltern Classics edition, which is absolutely beautiful. Can you see this? There you go. Get myself out. It's beautiful. It's got a nice golden spine. When you open it, the pages are glossy. I mean, really glossy, with a beautiful font. It's just a spectacular work of art. It's almost so good, it can only be used as a doorstop or a bookend. You don't want to read it in case you wear off the gilt edging. Anyway, Mansfield Park is a wonderful book. I've already read it. The reason I'm going over it again is because I'm going over all of Jane Austen's books again, ready to give some videos and opinions to my good friends and subscribers out there in BookTube land. When you get to Mansfield Park, the question that comes to mind is, what has happened to Jane Austen? Because most people start with Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. Brilliant. And then often they move on to Emma, which I believe came after this book. But Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility are sparkling and witty and frothy and light and all wonderful. Then you read Mansfield Park and you think, what happened in Jane Austen's life to make her change her tone so much? She's still as witty, she's still as acute, but instead of just being light and fun and frivolous as a social observer, here you wouldn't say she's cynical in Mansfield Park, but she has become very critical of the manners and morals and mores of the societal set that she talks about in her books. In the book Mansfield Park, you have these 3 sisters to start with. One marries above her station to his Sir Bertram. The second sister marries a clergyman, a curate, and lives nearby. And the third sister, the younger one, falls in love and marries for love someone who is in the army and ends up with a vast amount of children and is poor, living out in Portsmouth, I think it is. Fanny Price is the daughter of the third one. She is one of the daughters of the poor sister. And events work out to have Fanny move to her older sister, her aunt, who is Lady Bertram. And Lady Bertram thinks it'll be a good thing to bring up one of her nieces. So Fanny comes along to Mansfield Park, where she'll meet her cousins Tom and Edmund, the brothers, and Maria and Julia, her cousins, the sisters. The idea is she'll be raised to have good manners and make a suitable match, but she must know that she's not equal to her other cousins. And so she feels it growing up. Unlike other heroines of Jane Austen, Fanny is very, very reserved. She is very quiet. In fact, Jane Austen's mother said that she was a bit of a boring character, that she had nothing about her. I disagree, but she hasn't got that sparkle that the others have. What Jane Austen does with Fanny Price is to cast a critical eye on the folly and the laziness, the idleness, the morality of the bon ton, the good set. Because Tom, the eldest brother, he disappears quite quickly because he wants to go off to London and gamble and be a rake. Edmund, on the other hand, is really moral. He wants to become a clergyman, not just as a job, but because he believes in preaching the message. And he is very moral, and he and Fanny make a great friendship, and they become very close from early days. The two girls, Maria and Julia, they are somebody that Jane Austen dislikes because she's using them as the example of girls in her day who wanted to be quick into marriage so that they could set themselves up for life, to have wealth and money and prestige and position, those kind of things. The vanities of life. And Jane Austen can see this, but what she takes most issue with is the fakery of the moral stance. People act all polished in their manners, but they're out for greedy ends. One of them goes into an engagement with another man who she's going to marry, but she actually likes somebody else. And that is Henry Crawford. He turns up with his sister, Mary Crawford, and they are delightful. They have the most polished manners, everybody loves them, they're graceful, they're easy. They are kind to Fanny as well, but Fanny sees through the veneer of what they present. The way they speak, she senses, is not correct, as in not in polished form, but shows a soiled attitude of mind, a corroded sense of propriety of what is truly right and wrong. As the book progresses, you will see how the good Edmund is drawn in with them and is affected by their position on things and is blinded by the prettiness of pretty eyes, as it were, but how Fanny maintains her goodness and is sociable, but she always keeps her arm's length. She believes in what is true and good and in love. And this is what Jane Austen is really focusing on in this book, in Mansfield Park. She is saying that all the polished mannerisms of the high society, it is beautiful, it's wonderful, but it means nothing without a solid foundation, without genuine goodness. What's the point in acting prim and proper if one is carrying on indecent things? And you would never put the word adultery with Jane Austen, and yet it appears in here. Clearly, Jane Austen has become disillusioned with the world of her day. And there is a suggestion quite early on in the book that going into the city so regularly, the progression of society towards the city being dominant, is negative for morality. Oddly enough, this is something that connects Mansfield Park with Anna Karenina, because Tolstoy makes the same observation about Anna Karenina's fall. Austen had already made it decades before in Mansfield Park. And in that respect, it's a remarkable read. It is a brilliant book, brilliant. It's not always the favourite of everybody that reads Austen. Strangely enough, I believe it's third place, which is why it comes as such a shock after Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, because it's such a different angle. Its biggest weakness, in my opinion, is its ending. Austen seems to be making a point through the book, and when it comes to wrapping up the book at the end, it's done in quick sticks. You know, it breaks the sound barrier in how fast she wraps up everybody's sort of future. And that, I would say, was an error in her writing. However, it was gratifying. But the book itself and its observations and its insight into Jane Austen's own personal observations is beautiful. And I would highly recommend Mansfield Park. 4.5 out of 5, just because of the rushed ending. So that was my 4th book of the month. I did read other stuff as well. I also read poetry, mainly John Keats, not all of it, but about half of his works. John Keats, wonderfully romantic. He's one of the great romantic poets. And I recently read one of his poems. I'll put the video here. I read it quietly and slowly as a sort of sleep-inducing video because the words are so beautiful. They're so evocative. Listening to it back, I read a bit too quickly at the beginning, but halfway through it goes slow and somnambulant. So, but John Keats, I don't know how to cover this book in a review like this. I would need to go through poems individually. But John Keats is an excellent poet if you're looking for someone to start with in the classics. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please leave a comment below. Have you read any of the 4 books discussed in this video? What have you been reading this month that you would recommend to anyone else? And feel free to look at other people's comments and respond to them. Create a conversation around the classic books. Make some new connections out there in the world of BookTube land. Until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.